Welcome back to IGN's History of Awesome, a year-by-year breakdown of the biggest influencers of pop culture, everything involving games, movies, TV shows, toys, and more. Outer space was the place to be in 1979. Star Trek finally hit the big screen. Alien terrified pretty much everyone who saw it. And one of the most influential and funniest sci-fi books of all time was released, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Gaming also saw some genre shapers with the release of both Asteroids and Adventure, a hugely important game with a very simple name. To learn about all of this and more, let's now take a deeper look.
Welcome back to the History of Awesome. I am your host for this year. I am Justin Davis. I'm joined by Scott Kalura, Jared Petty, and Steve Butts. The year we're talking about is 1979, and this was an incredible year for film, a sort of incredible year for the still growing video game industry. And one of the things that I sort of really realized when I was researching this year is that I would see over and over again just the influence of Star Wars. In interview after interview, people said we had a really hard time getting this project off the ground. We were really into science fiction, and no one was interested in it. Then Star Wars came out, and that changed everything. Suddenly, there was all kinds of money to get all kinds of sci-fi projects off the ground. Incredible movies came out in '79, like Rocky II, Moonraker, The Jerk, Life of Brian, The Amityville Horror, Mad Max. The list goes on and on. But one that we absolutely have to stop on and spend some time talking about is Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Star Trek: The Motion Picture, wow, the big screen crew.
The title says it all, right? Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Yeah.
It's like so lovingly generic.
lots and lots of loving external shots of the Enterprise.
Oh yeah, it's Enterprise porn.
Yeah, it is.
What it is.
Really is.
I mean, one thing that people don't realize, or maybe everyone sort of knew this, but in my chronology, I didn't realize that Star Trek had been off the air 10 years.
Yeah.
Because they tried Phase 2, they tried to reboot the television show, and that kind of didn't get off the ground.
Right.
And they couldn't get the money to get the movie made, and so it was 10 years that Star Trek had been gone before this movie came out, and really, it brought Star Trek back to life.
Yeah, and like you say, Star Wars came out in '77, and that was kind of the kick that it needed to suddenly it was a priority, and Paramount had this franchise ready built, So, but yeah, I mean, when you watch Star Trek: The Motion Picture, there's this thing where people remember the old Star Trek movies as being a bunch of old guys. But when you watch the motion picture, they look a lot like they did on the show, actually. They're still fairly young. But in a lot of, and I love that movie, but it's not the best Star Trek movie. It's hugely important Star Trek movie.
It's very slow paced. I mean, the movie made a lot of money. It was very successful financially, and obviously spawned this media empire. But the movie is very slow paced, very little action, very sort of cerebral storyline.
Which contrasts with Star Wars quite a bit, right? And in addition, Star Wars had this sort of mystical element, this high fantasy sort of vibe. Star Trek is very deliberate, very methodical, and also tied very much to our own experience. With a big spoiler kind of twist at the end, like that was news just a few years prior.
Yeah, it's kind of weird esoteric movie. It also happens in the sort of future of the 1970s. Everything's very cleaned up and and they drop that aesthetic in the later Star Trek films, I think for good reason. But it also makes this one stand alone as a really kind of interesting, optimistic, thoughtful, slow movie. Some people say it's boring. I actually really enjoy it. I think it's still a very Star Trek film. It's about the relationships between the characters. It's about possibility. It's about
the crew getting back together.
Yeah, exactly.
Trusting each other and
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's very classic Trek in that sense. What it sort of lacks in, an epic sort of storyline, or later we would get, Wrath of Khan, these iconic villains. It makes up for by it has robot doppelgangers and other dimensions and debating what makes life and whether something counts as being life or not.
It was the first bald lady I'd ever seen.
It also does a neat thing with Kirk as kind of the odd man out, kind of coming back to it, and they run with that in an interesting direction. I think it works pretty well for the film. And again, you play on the relationship between Spock, McCoy, Kirk, all being there. You still have that triangle that forms the core of things. You introduce a couple of new characters, but what I really love about that movie more than anything else is that twist that Steve mentioned. The fact that you have an element of human space exploration come back and find us.
Yeah, I think we can spoil the twist. If you haven't seen Star Trek: The Motion Picture, stop this episode of History of Awesome. But as we talked about in the '77 episode, we launched Voyager 1 and 2, and it's a very optimistic, hopeful. Human beings are trying to reach out there to the stars. And then Star Trek does a great job of sort of flipping that on its head and bringing that back around just a couple years later.
And so Voyager, who's one of the Voyager probes, it's basically going through its adolescence. It's evolved into this godlike being, but it's still just looking for what everyone else is looking for. It's looking for meaning in its life, and I mean that's such a Star Trek concept.
Yeah.
It doesn't get better than that. And Spock is really, in a way, the other main character, but he's going through the same thing. Yeah. He's trying to achieve ultimate logic, which isn't right for him because he's half human, and he's going through the same thing Voyager is. And V'ger is, and ultimately Spock cries, which once you get Spock crying, then you know you've hit pay dirt on Star Trek.
And it's a wonderfully hopeful film in that regard. Even though it begins with a threat of apocalypse, it ends with this sort of Star Trek reminder that we can aspire to better things. You know, Star Trek is about what we could be at our best.
And this is something that's not, unique to Star Trek the Motion Picture. It's what I love. I'm actually more of a Star Trek guy than a Star Wars guy. Not that you have to pick a side, but if I was forced, that's the side that I land on. Because I do love that sort of optimistic view of the future. It's showing humans kind of at their best, and it feels like a warm blanket to sort of hope, when I watch an episode of Star Trek that, we can aspire to be like that and be inclusive and really thoughtful in the way that we solve problems. And, they sort of twisted around in Deep Space Nine a little bit, but especially this early Trek, the humans were always the good guys, which, no, that's not realistic in the slightest, but I enjoy that as, as entertainment.
Yeah, certainly. It's nice, and it's rare. I think it's more and more rare these days. If you think about Star Trek the Motion Picture, there's not really a villain in it. No. I mean, the V'ger is not a bad guy, for lack of a better term. Right? I mean, he's just looking for something, and so there's not too many movies where you can say there's no bad guy.
Yeah,
I think one of the other things that Star Trek did, and I mean this has obviously become much more relevant over the years, is people were getting a chance to go to the movies now to see something they had only enjoyed on television, and to see the big budget version, like sort of larger than life, with lots of money now for sets and effects that they just didn't have when they were producing the show in the 60s.
That's true.
Although they were
unheard of, I think, right?
The movie sort of famously ran into all kinds of production problems. It was a big challenge to make that movie. It was behind schedule, it was over budget, and they were reusing sets from, again, the Phase 2 television show that didn't get off the ground. So it's kind of a miracle that it came together at all.
Yeah, and it was directed by Robert Wise, who was a Hollywood legend. There's a guy who did like Sound of Music and West Side Story, which doesn't necessarily sound like the right fit for a Star Trek movie, but I don't know. But they did have a lot of problems making that film, and I think that the studio expected it to be a disaster.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, it actually made money for them, and as we know, the franchise continues.
I mean, then when you add in Generations and all the Next Generation type stuff, I mean, to spawn a franchise, it's phenomenal in the movie theaters.
Yeah. If it had. I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
if it had just gone to the Phase 2 TV show it was supposed to do in the mid-'70s, that could have been the end of it. It could have been a middling show, but the classic Star Trek never did great ratings, the TV show. And so if it had just been a sequel show that kind of came about because of the fan need for that, it probably would have done okay ratings. Who knows? And that could have just been the end of it. But this movie gave us, as you say, all the rest of it.
And people sort of hold that original series in such high regard, but it was just 3 seasons. I mean, it wasn't anywhere near what Next Generation was, which followed it.
Yeah. We Star Trek would go on to another piece of research that I sort of found preparing for the show was that it had the biggest opening weekend of any movie ever at the time it came out. It made $11 million, and its final run it made money, not a gigantic amount of money, but that sort of opening weekend, let's all rush out and see it right away. Star Trek did that better than anything else that had come before. Wow. Sort of way on the other side of the sci-fi spectrum, another movie that really only got made because of the success of Star Wars was Alien. And it's interesting, part of the reason why I'm really excited about this project, History of Awesome, is to realize that those two movies existed in the same space in the same year. And, very different, both sci-fi movies, but incredibly different in tone and their vision of the future and all the rest of it, and would go on to spawn iconic media franchises.
It's funny because you call it a sci-fi movie, but I still think of Alien first and foremost as a horror movie.
Yeah, right? I would agree with that.
But it's in a sci-fi context. But I think for me, the thing that really makes that movie work for me, apart from sort of the sort of implied sexual violence, kind of at the heart of all the terror in it, is just a fantastic art direction. like just the visual design by H.R. Giger.
It's incredible, right?
It just like it makes that movie for me, and there's nothing that's as identifiable as that style for me from that period.
Yeah, the art direction and production design are superb, and like you said, it's a horror film. It is the ultimate haunted house movie. It's a haunted house, and there's no way out. You're just stuck there, and it's wonderful. I also love about Alien that you don't really know who the protagonist of Alien is until almost the end of the movie.
It's very unconventional, you know, in the way that everyone does share the screen in that way. It's a very slow build. Like I watched Alien again a couple of years ago, and it was very different than I remember. The full front third of that movie, I was like, wow, there's a lot going on here.
Everyone remembers Ripley as being, because of the series that followed it, everyone remembers it being Ripley's series, but you kind of are expecting Dallas, the Tom Skerritt character, to be the lead. He's the traditional Hollywood dude.
And her victory is almost sort of accidental or incidental, I guess. You know, she just happens to be the person who lives through it all.
Yeah, exactly. Which is one of the great themes that carries the horror. Everybody's in danger. If you don't know what's going to happen in Alien, then everybody really feels like they're in absolute danger through the whole thing. Also, there's an evil robot that you don't know is an evil robot. You know, usually in movies when you have an evil robot, it's some big metal box that's like, you know, fish and plankton, and you know. But in this case, like, the last 20 minutes of the movie, holy crap, evil robot!
Ash is a robot!
Yeah, it's a fantastic twist.
It is.
And if you go back and watch it, Ash, played by Ian Holm, he acts totally like just a regular human. He does weird little mannerisms and stuff. There's nothing that would indicate that he's a robot earlier in the film, which of course just adds to the insane surprise when he suddenly weirdly rolling up a magazine and trying to shove it down her throat.
Yeah, if for some reason you haven't seen this movie, this is a movie where Bilbo Baggins tries to choke somebody with a magazine. I mean, it's amazing.
His central processor is not working correctly, because if that's his method of murder.
Alien became such an iconic movie and started so many tropes that, you know, things that you would sort of make fun, like in space, no one can hear you scream, was the tagline for that movie. Like now it's sort of a silly thing that people would poke fun at.
It's a cliche.
Yeah, like it was so good at what it did and became such a part of, you know, pop culture and our consciousness that, you know, the tropes of, you know, the super strong female protagonist in sci-fi, you know, not that that was necessarily the very first movie to ever do that, but it elevated these things, you know, to a higher level of sort of pop culture consciousness.
Oh, yeah,
you know, Ripley's a fantastic character.
There are two things that I really love about it that we haven't covered off on yet, though. The first is that they don't bother to explain anything that's going on, right? There's no backstory for the alien. There's no big mystery to uncover. It's just survival. And that's it. That's all they have time for. Who cares about the rest of it, right? And I love being able to sort of speculate as a viewer about what the background of all this stuff is.
Yeah, the space jockey, you don't know what his story is.
And the second thing is that Chestburster scene. I mean, that just came out of nowhere. And even today, I think watching it, if you're not aware that that's coming up, as indeed I think the actors weren't aware during the actual shoot, that was a surprise to them as well. So those terrified reactions on the faces of his fellow diners are largely not acting. I mean, those people are really terrified. Wow. But that just, I mean, that sets the movie off in this whole other direction, and suddenly you realize what's at stake here.
Oh, yeah. I remember I saw that scene, it was on at my cousin's house. It was on like HBO or something, and we saw that scene, and then that was it. I didn't see the rest of the movie for like 3 years after that.
My dad used to own a comic book shop, and in 1982 he was having a convention, and somebody had that movie at one of their tables playing on a videotape. And I remember as a 10-year-old kid, I'd tell my dad, hey, I'm going to go wander around. And I would just go and sit in front of this guy's booth and just watch that movie as a 10-year-old kid. And my dad obviously was busy with other stuff. But yeah, that movie impacted me tremendously just as a young kid.
Another thing, another thing I love about it is just how it's these working class schlubs who are thrown into the situation. It's not the traditional space hero, or and it takes something from Star Wars in that it's very much a used, lived-in world. It's not the clean, polished, you know, Starship Enterprise. It's this grimy, grungy, like, truck in outer space that they're on, basically.
And because they're ordinary characters, you get this wonderful moment, you know, with Ian Holmes' head laying on a counter. They plug it back in, you know. How do we kill it? Right. You can't. That's just one of the best moments. So these ordinary people are powerless against this threat. It's just so great.
Yeah.
It really is a movie of moments, you know, with the chestburster scene and the big twist with the android. It's just fantastic. You know, one of the things, being sort of the science nerd that I am, I like the aspect sort of the hard science of it, you know, compared to, again, I am a giant Star Trek fan, but it's very fast and loose with the actual science. You know, it's kind of more like magic a lot of times. And it was obvious that a lot of care went into Alien in that sense. I guess they do have flamethrowers on their ship, so maybe not, maybe not too much care. But, you know, I liked it, intrigued, you know, when I watched that movie when I was younger, just sort of the, you know, they're out there to make money for a corporation, and, you know, they were put to sleep because there's no faster than light travel or anything like that. I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Oh, yeah, it's great. Yeah.
A lot of those similar tropes were copped for The Abyss as well, where it's sort of, you know, oil rig workers and like this sort of the working class person confronting this sort of supernatural or numinous being, and just being just dwarfed by it, both psychically and physically.
But if Ed Harris had been on that spaceship, they'd have killed the alien.
Quite likely.
So we, switching gears in a wildly different direction, and that's what I really like about 1979 is it does have this sort of this breadth of, you know, content that would go on to influence people for decades to come. The Dukes of Hazzard debuted on television that year.
Okay, that when I was a kid, the Dukes of Hazzard was the biggest thing in the universe. I mean,
in your universe?
Yeah, I had to be. Well, in the universe.
Jared and I are each from North Carolina.
Yeah.
As a kid in North Carolina back then, it was amazing.
I remember I got in trouble in preschool for going, you know, whenever the Dukes of Hazzard would jump over one of Hazzard County's numerous dry creek beds, they would go, hee-haw! I got in real trouble in preschool for doing that over and over. One of my teachers actually yelled at me and told me this was not Hazzard County because I kept insisting on doing it. The Dukes of Hazzard was, you know, it was mostly made for kids. It was a stupid show.
I mean, that's what stands out to me is the Dukes of Hazzard is an insane premise for a television show by today's standards. You know, it's basically these two brothers just cruising around, you know, tearing everything up. Like, that's really kind of it.
Your protagonists are two convicted felons driving around in a stock car and shooting bows and arrows with dynamite tied to them.
You know, and they are heroes. You know, they're putting a stop to Boss Hogg on a week in, week out basis, but they're not. They don't set out to do that. You know, they stumble upon these schemes every week and sort of end up embroiled in all this business.
But it had this sort of coolness and like chic to like so many elements. Like there's the Daisy Dukes, and then there's the 1969 Charger. There are a lot of just iconic things that. Just as a young boy, like just totally captivated me, filled my consciousness almost every waking moment, kind of thinking about that.
Yeah.
Maybe the Catherine Bach thing a little too much. Like how many Dodge Chargers did they go through to make that
they
show?
went through
Hundreds.
a lot of them. I have a friend actually that has the fender from one of them hanging in his living room to this day. He's got a piece of one of the General Lee's. Yeah. Also, he had that theme song, which I think had a lot to do with the show's success, frankly.
Song,
the Waylon Jennings song, and that's become iconic. And also, you know, Dixie on the horn, etc. You know, I grew up in the South, and so a lot of I've met these people, or at least the caricatures they represent. And
you know at least one person named Cooter.
I know a guy named Tater.
I know a guy named Cooter.
You know, the theme song thing is a great point, and it's something we're missing these days because in the rush to cram as much programming in or as much advertising in, perhaps. We don't have theme songs on a lot of our shows these days. It's the quick title logo and that's it, you know. And I think you're right. I think a theme song can do a lot to make a show successful.
It's a mood setter. It's like, hey, this is what we're getting ready to do now. Get with us. Get on board.
Yeah. You gotta get these good old boys are cruising around, and you got to get on board. Exactly right.
They are, in fact, never meaning no harm.
Do you remember these celebrity speed trap segments that they would have on the show?
Vaguely.
I think
they eventually faded them out.
It was sort of like Batman and Robin climbing up the side of the building and being like Werner Klemper or whoever.
You never get it as a kid. But
it's just another aspect of this show just being insane, where they wanted to get these famous country artists on the show, and so they would be driving through Hazzard County and would get stopped in these totally fake setup speed traps because Boss Hogg wanted, well, you know, I gotta arrest you for this speed trap, or you can just play a song for us down at the local. And so then the end of the episode would always be these country stars, just all the cast members just sitting around hooting and hollering. Like, it's insane. Like, there's no.
That's a very Southern thing, though. They do the same thing on Nashville. They did the same thing on the Andy Griffith Show. This idea that like you have what is it, etic, like whatever the perspective is, where like that musical appearance is part of the world of the characters that they're experiencing. That's a very Southern thing.
And then, of course, there was the great tragedy. I remember I was sitting at a Friendly's restaurant with my grandparents when I was a little child, and they informed me that they had read in the newspaper that Bo and Luke were not going to be on the Dukes of Hazzard this season, and I cried and cried into into my ice cream at Friendly's.
So they just replaced them wholesale. Yeah. Bo and Luke. So first of all, the premise of the show is that they're on probation and can't leave Hazzard County. But Bo and Luke somehow leave and go join NASCAR. Never explained in the context of their probation.
And they're cousins, right?
And their cousin Coy and Vance show up that look and act exactly like them.
Bo and Luke are cousins as well, right?
Right. Are they brothers?
I thought they're brothers. And Bo and Luke are brothers.
Okay. But Daisy's their cousin?
Yeah. Okay, all right.
So
don't think too hard about it, Scott.
So Coy and Vance,
family tree.
Coy and Vance show up. They're there for half a season or so, and then their contracts get sorted out. So Bo and Luke can come back, and then Coy and Vance are just gone.
Yeah,
like they're gone within the first commercial break of the episode.
They were gone, and kiddom rejoiced.
And then they were never mentioned again.
This happens though. I mean, you have these disputes, and the actor leaves, and they just bring in somebody else to read exactly the same lines, but under a different title. Whitman Mayo did it on Sanford and Son when he took over for Red Fox. You remember Don Knotts left Andy Griffith in season 6, and they just brought in some guy they called Warren, and he just did all the Don Knotts script, and it never really works very well.
X-Files even kind of did it, right?
True. I think MASH is the only show that ever really pulled it off. That's the only one I can
There's been a few examples.
MASH, I think MASH was more nuanced in how it did it, and the characters tended to be, like you lost Frank Burns, you got Winchester. They were both the kind of jerky character, but they were different characters.
They were not exactly the same person. You're right. They did replace them more intelligently. I agree.
So the majority of History of Awesome is talking about sort of the biggest movies and games and the things that are right down that IGN strike plate. But we are kind of trying to spotlight some of the coolest books and comic books that happened each year as well, when they're especially iconic. And we can't let 79 go by without at least touching on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah, I mean, the fabulous, famous, it began as a radio play, but it's been basically every other form of media since then.
Absolutely. And to think about the fact that this funny, quirky, humorous, British sci-fi comedy has become what amounts to a massive multimedia franchise. I don't think there's a lot like that. Hitchhiker's Guide manages to be clever, funny, sad, and sweet all at the same time, and minute to minute, and it clicks so well. It's
the most quintessentially British thing that I think I've seen, based on what I understand about what it's like to be British, where it is that sort of very self-deprecating humor, and it is very sad and funny at the same time. It really pulls that off.
The thing that makes it British, and this is true of Fawlty Towers, Monty Python, all that other stuff, is they never wink at the audience, right? Like the joke is there, and you can get it or not, but we're moving on, right? They don't have that sort of highly arched humor that you found in American comedy in the 70s. You and I mean, we talked about Hitchhiker's Guide this morning
for an hour, exactly.
The thing I love about it is that there's a great book called Don't Panic by Neil Gaiman. He wrote, right after he'd done Black Orchid, before he even got to Sandman, he wrote this book about the creation of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. And he mentions there's sort of two starting points. One is a young Douglas Adams, 18 years old, hitchhiking his way through Europe with a stolen copy of A Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe, passing out in the field and looking up at the stars and wondering, I wonder if there's something like this on a galactic level. I wonder if there's a book that sort of lets people know how to get from star to star.
So fantastic.
And then he pitches a radio series to BBC. He had been working with Graham Chapman and a couple other folks that he had met working with some of the theatrical companies that were around the Cambridge area at that time. And the series was called The Ends of the Earth, and it was going to be episodic, and each installment was going to be a different way that the Earth ends. He thought the first one should be a guy whose house is getting demolished to make way for a hyperspace bypass, or for a bypass, and that the same thing would happen to the Earth in that same episode. And he thought, how interesting would it be to have an alien there to provide additional perspective? And he liked that first idea so much that he combined it with this Hitchhiker's Guide, and that was it. Suddenly he had a series.
And then he goes on, go ahead.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we have to switch gears. I mean, I love Hitchhiker's Guide. I love the Ford Prefect joke. I love all the sillier jokes. I love everything about it.
But oh my gosh, so good.
All those were wonderful.
We also have to talk about, 1979 is the year that sort of Iron Man in the world of comic books became grew into the iconic character that it really established who he is to this day, over 30 years.
Right, he was kind of a second-tier character up to that point, and then you get Demon in a Bottle, which, Marvel Comics has always been really good at character vulnerability. Most Marvel heroes, their weakness is themselves, something within them, some flaw, whether it be the Incredible Hulk's power or whether it be Wolverine's anger, and you can just go down a list. Almost everyone. Peter Parker's haunted because of what happened to his family. Tony Stark's an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And I remember reading this book. I found this pile of old comic books when I was in elementary school, and this whole series was there in it, and reading these and being like, oh, this makes so much sense. Suddenly, Tony Stark, who was just this kind of guy that walked around in a big metal suit, became a real hero because he had something inside himself that he had to overcome, and other people suffered because of what had happened within him, because of this vulnerability, and because he was tragic, very much like, and not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but very much like a great Norse hero. He was vulnerable, he had to fail, and he had to overcome, and in the overcoming became a hero even though he lost something. Demon in a Bottle does that better than most comic book storylines did at that time.
He even turns on his allies. I mean, he's got Betty Cabe, who's his girlfriend. He's got Jarvis, who's his butler. Like, he really gets awful to them.
Yeah.
And he's dealing with all these other pressures. There's Hammer Industries, this British outfit's trying to take down Stark International, and he ends up, they end up taking control of his armor, and he ends up killing some foreign diplomat in full view of the public. And then now he's sort of on trial for murder, and his girlfriend's giving him a hard time, and this guy's trying to buy his company, and it's like he turns to alcohol as a refuge.
And I was only a kid, and I grew up in a very stable family, but I knew drunks, and I recognized that meanness, and I recognized that frustration, and it made him so identifiable, so relatable. And when he did make it through it, when he finally overcomes it, it's just a beautiful moment. And suddenly this guy turns from kind of second-tier Bruce Wayne of the Marvel Universe into somebody I was followed religiously for the rest of my life.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's certainly a huge number of people that are in your boat. You know, it established a character that we're still, you know, that they're still building on, you know, in 2015, all these years later.
Don't know that Disney's ever going to get that dark with the character that most people are exposed to.
No, I mean, they've touched on
those
certain
origins.
aspects of those characters, certainly in the movies, but yeah. I
think we used to expect that they might go in that direction, but it was before Disney owned Marvel. And the filmmakers kind of, back when it was still Jon Favreau, he was sort of saying, yeah, we're going to get to that maybe, but I think you're right, it doesn't make much sense. And once Disney bought it, there's elements of it in the second one, Iron Man 2, sort of. But
there's also the weird real-world meta thing with Robert Downey Jr., who almost lost his career.
It's a perfect person.
That's why it always made sense that he was the one cast as Iron Man, right? I just wanted to point out, there's a weird bit of trivia, which is in one of the last issues of the storyline, Jarvis quits because he can't take it anymore. And he writes a note to, a letter of resignation, basically. And apparently that letter was actually Dave Cockrum, I believe, a Marvel artist. It was the actual letter he had written when he resigned from Marvel, and they just put Jarvis's name in place of Cockrum.
Wow.
There's a great book called Marvel: The Untold Story, and it's full of all these little anecdotes where you realize the things that are playing out in the panels are actually representing struggles and sort of attitudes and arguments that are going on within Marvel at the time. And that's just one fantastic example.
That's a great book, isn't it?
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, you know, the thing that's super exciting about the late 70s and early 80s, you know, from sort of a pop culture perspective, is just as movies are becoming, you know, they're making more and more movies that I'm interested in. For me, you know, the video game industry was also continuing to take off. And 79 had a bunch of interesting video games, but there's two that we have to sort of highlight and spotlight. The first is Asteroids. Jared, I know this is a game that's near and dear to your heart.
It's one of my favorite video games. Asteroids is a beautiful vector graphics game, even though it's monochromatic. It's only, it's just black and white, but it's drawn with those wonderful vector light guns. So you get this super crisp image. Unless you've seen one with your own eyes, no photo or video does it justice. You just got to see it. And this blinding, beautiful light, and this really, really difficult to control, but once you get good at it, artfully maneuverable spaceship.
I mean, that's what really stands out to me about Asteroids is a lot of old games, games from that era I can appreciate on, the incredible technical hurdles that they had to overcome. I don't really consider very many of them that playable by today's standards. But Asteroids is immensely playable. You know, very, very fluid physics, realistic, the momentum of your ship, all of that it's kind of incredible how easy it is to pick up and understand and play by today's standards.
The thing that to me is sort of at the heart of that game is that it delivers this proposition of risk to the player with, are you going to move your ship or not? Right? And like once you do, things can get a little better for you, but they can get a lot worse, right? And it sort of allows you to kind of manage your comfort level there, but once those asteroids start coming towards the middle of the screen, it's like you're in this place where you're sort of trepidatious about it all, but you've got to do it, right? And sort of inviting the player to participate in that in a very dynamic way, something that a lot of games of that era I think missed or didn't offer.
And hyperspace takes that even another level, right?
Just like hit the button and hope you don't spawn on top of an asteroid. Which the controls are all buttons. There's no joystick in Asteroids. You're controlling with buttons. It's also Atari going all in on space. Nolan Bushnell's first video game was computer space. Asteroids really is just kind of like a super streamlined, revised version of computer Invader space. But you've got, Space Invaders has come along just before this, and you've got spaces everywhere, Star Wars, Star Trek, just like we talked about. This is Atari's all-in on space game, and they nail it.
Absolutely.
I think when you look at the version that then came out on the, I guess it was the Atari 2600, it kind of illustrates what works about the arcade game, because suddenly you're using the joystick instead of the complicated, like it was much more challenging, the arcade version. But also, weren't the asteroids all colored in the Atari game? Suddenly?
Yes, that's due to the limitations of the 2600's hardware. Although people have come along just the last couple of years and figured out a way to make it look much more like the arcade version. But yeah, they're all colored. It does play quite well, though.
It never felt like the same game, though.
No, it isn't. It's a very good port, but an adaptation, but it's not the same game.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Asteroids would, it was sort of in the middle of Atari's period of being able to do no wrong. I mean, that game, over 70,000 Asteroids cabinets were made. It made over $150 million in revenue for the company, and reportedly, it's hard to get exact figures, but $500 million that game pulled in for arcade owners and operators.
And this, again, that's in 1979.
That's in $79, in quarters. And that's also, running parallel to their home games business expanding. And, again, a bunch of really interesting Atari games came out around this age. But, the one that's emblematic of all the success that the company was having was Adventure.
Yeah. Oh, now, Adventure is one of the most important video games ever made.
Absolutely, yes. And I knew, I had some understanding of this, but, in reading up about it, just the amount of probably the very first action-adventure game that ever existed, probably the first fantasy video game that existed. It's an open-world game, so you can go anywhere right from the start. The amount of ground that game broke is
It is fundamentally the Legend of Zelda told several years before. The graphics are very primitive, but the fact that there are graphics at all is an act of genius. Warren Robinett takes text adventure fantasy games that are made to run on mainframes and says, I'm going to take a computer that has less than 1K of RAM on the Atari 2600, and I'm going to convert all this text into symbols. And I'm going to,
wonderfully abstract. I mean, the sword is literally an arrow. Your avatar is a square. You see the dragon there. Everybody sort of famously says it looks like a duck. But I was totally bought in as a kid. Sid Meier said at GDC a couple of years ago, he said, our technology has increased 10,000 times since then, but I don't know that the quality of our storytelling has. And emotional engagement for me in a game like this was so high. I was so all in. And you mentioned the open world aspect, especially on that third mode. The first one was sort of the easy one. The second one included the invisible maze and everything. But that third mode where they randomized the placement of items. And they didn't even care if they put the white key in the White Castle. Like, that's just how that...
Well, Robin and I talked about that. That was a bug. He didn't intend that to happen. We had a conversation about that once. But yeah, it's a really wonderful thing. That open world, all the items to explore, and just the sheer genius of taking something that happened in your imagination and finding a way to put it on a screen, taking something you controlled with words on a keyboard and making it work with a stick and a button.
And then it lived even in spite of your interactions, right? The dragons would follow you and the bat would grab something and fly off.
The dragons all had different AI. The dragons, they all had unique personalities depending on their color. I mean, it was insane. The 2600 should not have been able to do that.
There was a game that there was a lot of emotion when you were playing that game. I can remember like screaming when the dragon would come out, and my sister screaming, and and I recently bought one of those the fake Atari thing that has like 50 games on it, and I introduced my son to Adventure, and it was the same reaction. And he's a modern game kid, and the same adventure, same reaction, screaming, and
that's a great anecdote. I used it when I was teaching English in Japan with my high school students. They'd never seen it, most of them, and they would play it, would use it for teaching English lessons, but they would not want to stop playing it once they figured out what was going on. Also important, I think this is the advent of evil bats in video games.
Possibly. I love the idea of your Japanese students like really understanding the importance of words like dragon, castle, and sword. These are parts of your vocabulary you can't possibly neglect.
It was more telling them how to get there, what to find, do you enjoy this, that kind of thing. We built on the conversation from there. And then, of course, the famous Easter egg. It was not the very first Easter egg.
So let's back up. I mean, the creation of Adventure itself is actually pretty interesting.
They didn't want him to make it. Well, not they, but his immediate boss told him not to work on it because it wasn't possible. So he developed the first part of Adventure in secret.
Right. So this is already, Atari as a company, I guess kind of famously, I'm trying to figure out how to mince my words, but maybe I don't need to. I mean, they didn't treat their game creators that great.
No, they didn't. Not at that point.
Well, they didn't want them to get credit, at least. I mean, which I think was one of Robinett's sticking points.
And so that's what led to, Jared Jared, as you like to point out, it's not technically the very first Easter egg in a video game, but I think it is the first time that they use the term Easter egg.
It's the first time they use the term Easter egg, exactly. That
so
all
it's
goes
incredibly
to a story.
why don't you walk through, if someone doesn't know, what you actually need to do to access
so you go up to the maze on the left, you go up to the castle.
You gotta go to the Black Castle, you go
but it's insane, it's incredibly complex.
You go to the Black Castle, you go to a fog of war maze, and then there's a room hidden in the fog of war maze that you can only find using a bridge, and you go across the bridge, and in that room is a 1-pixel invisible item.
It's not even in the room, it's just outside there.
Yeah,
you have to cram yourself into it,
cram into it. You then carry that invisible item with no description to the other side of the map, lay it in another room where there's a wall, then go get 2 other items, bring those items into the room, and then you can walk through the wall, and there's his name.
Created by Warren Robin.
Yeah, and a 15-year-old kid found this.
Yeah,
how did word get around though? Like, because I remember looking for it and finding it, but how did I know? I couldn't Google it back then.
I don't know how word got around. I know that Atari found out when the kid sent him a letter, but I don't know how the word got out.
And then they had a choice to make. They had a choice to make about creating a new game ROM, to get rid of that, but that was going to be fantastically expensive. So instead, they chose to embrace it and said, "Well, this is an Easter egg."
Well, now you can go to YouTube or wikis online and find this stuff. But back then, there were little paperback books, Secrets of the Games, and they would have 80 different games in them, and I imagine Adventure was one of those games. I don't remember how I found it.
Maybe Jeff Roven told us. I don't know.
That might have been it.
So, I mean, Jared, you touched on it briefly, and you were talking about how you actually had to find this Easter egg that had the credits in it. But this is actually a game that did Fog of War for the first time. Just add it to the list of the games first.
Yeah, it's got this active Fog of War that's moving with, again, just innovation after innovation, keys that open doors symbolically, picking up and dropping items. Just nothing like that. It all sounds so fundamental, but this was one of video gaming's great leaps forward.
Well, I also don't think people completely understand just how primitive the 2600 of the VCS was, to the point where many of the screens in the game, or I think most or almost all, had to be mirror images of each other, just because of a quirk of how the VCS actually worked. So imagine creating, a 3D space where each side of the screen has to be mirrored.
And I think this is a good way to put it. The Atari 2600 could address a 4K ROM at that period. That was all you could have. So he had to put his entire program on one typed sheet of paper. That's really what it amounts to. His program was written in that.
Wow. I can't even imagine that.
He also, I read that created by Warren Robin at Easter egg took up 5% of the games, took up 5% of the 4K.
Yeah, he had leftover. So he's like, why not? Let's do it.
Such a fantastic anecdote.
I remember speed running that. I mean, like even back then, trying to get through that second mode where everything was placed, and to see how fast I could get to that credit screen, and timing myself, like with a little watch.
How'd you do?
I can't remember what my time was. I think it was around 2.5 minutes. Maybe it was less than that. We'll have to get a copy of it and play it here and see how fast we go through it.
So I got a copy on my desk.
The last sort of key point about Adventure that I want to touch on, that I'd actually never really considered before, before we were speaking about it a little earlier, was that this is one of the first examples of the difference between a console game and an arcade game, and that sort of was mind-blowing to me when I sort of had that realization, where arcade games are designed to gobble up quarters and exist on one screen, no instructions, no rules, and Adventure had the luxury of you were playing it at home in your living room, and there was no need to kill the player every 3 minutes to continue making more money. That's really important.
Yeah, that might be the most important distinction about it, is that this is a game that was made for consoles, and the kind of game that could only exist on consoles, and
maybe the first game like that. Besides accepting text adventures and some other things.
It's Superman. It's the first good one that I can think of anyway. Superman was somewhat similar, but it was also kind of terrible.
Sure.
Oh gosh, I remember that one.
It was awful.
I mean, that's kind of the story of a lot of the 2600 games.
Yeah, there are a lot of bad games in 2600.
But there were other notable video games that came out in 2600: Galaxian, Akalabeth, and Lunar Lander. We don't have time. We wanted to make sure that we really emphasized how important Adventure was. I don't know, I think that's 1979, guys. Just yet another fantastic year for pop culture. Everybody watching, thank you for tuning in and going down this 1979 memory lane with us. Coming up in 1980 is really sort of the explosion of the arcade era with games like Centipede, Pac-Man, Missile Command, etc. Also really interesting movies, incredible movies like Empire Strikes Back, Friday the 13th, Superman 2. So stay tuned for more History of Awesome.